For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our listeners. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a recurring monthly supporter. If you feel inspired to contribute, you can make a donation by following the link in the podcast notes. You can also help by sharing our podcast on social media and writing us a review on iTunes. Anarchy is a central component to the rewilding movement, and as such, it is here that I wanted to place my first interview. Today I'm chatting with Kevin Tucker, an anarchist, writer, editor, and publisher who's been writing about primal anarchy for over 20 years. He's the author of the book For Wildness and Anarchy, which has been foundational to anarcho-primitivism and now primal anarchy. He is relentless. He runs a publishing company, hosts a podcast, writes extensively well-researched books, publishes Wild Resistance, a primal anarchy journal, twice a year, and somehow raises 2 children all at the same time. Kevin is both a friend and colleague who continues to inspire and inform the work that I do. I'm excited to share the interview with you, so here it goes. Kevin, welcome to the Rewilding podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
One of the reasons why I wanted to start with have the first interview be with you on the podcast here is obviously your history within this movement, but also because of my understanding of how central and primary primal anarchy is to rewilding itself as a movement. The first time I started to, there's been times where I've self-identified as an anarchist, but I think the first time I really was like, oh, that's actually a thing, and oh, I actually am aligned with this way of thinking, was that ancient interview with John Zerzan that Derek Jensen had done. It was called You May Be an Anarchist and Not Even Know It, or something along those lines. I just remember reading that and being like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess I'm an anarchist then. But I never really called myself that until later on I started getting into Green Anarchy magazine. My understanding, the most basic level of anarchy is just recognizing that humans are fine without living under state rule. And so I guess my first question is that anarchy? How would you define anarchy in the most general sense?
This question has different layers to it. What is anarchy and what is anarchism? Who's an anarchist? Really what it means to be an anarchist is that you don't believe government is necessary. You don't believe the state is necessary. It's a pretty low bar. What anarchy would be a society without government, a society without state. That doesn't preclude for a lot of people state-level societies, which is a huge thing within anarchism. The idea of it is anarchism is you're against government. You're against control, you're against rule in that sort of regard. What that means for each branch of anarchism is effectively a question of what constitutes government, what constitutes control. There's a lot of different ways it goes. You have communalistic sides of anarchism. You have individualistic, egoistic sides of anarchism. Really contradictory kind of things in every regard. And classically, that was traditional anarchism, red anarchism versus green anarchism. So effectively, do we want industrial society or do we want, field factories and workshops, or are we going to say that civilization itself is a problem? Naturally, I'm in the civilization itself is a problem camp. And I also like to put it as the question of red versus green anarchy is, do you like work or do you not like work? Nobody likes work, except for people who genuinely have come down to believe that there's, that this stuff has some kind of inherent worth or meaning. And I think it's increasingly important to contextualize anarchism and anarchist theorists. A lot of the people that are being repeated now quite often, like the classical anarchists, most of them died not long into the Industrial Revolution, before World War I, some before, or most before World War II. Like, the world has really changed. The technology has really changed it. And, I think that Kropotkin is definitely one of the most interesting anarchists, in my opinion, because Mutual Aid, the first third of that book is straight up primal anarchy, anarcho-primitivism. And not just for human societies, but he was a naturalist. He was a guy who was arguing with Darwin at the time that the principle of evolution was mutual aid, not survival of the fittest. So, like, as a naturalist, as anybody's into rewilding, that stuff's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with Kropotkin is that he did all this amazing work as a naturalist, and he talked about anarchy as something that existed amongst indigenous societies, and he talks about hunter-gatherers, he talks about horticulturalists. But then he just went ahead and extrapolated all that to finding this current of anarchy in terms of resistance within agrarian societies and within all these other societies, and just kept kind of extrapolating that. That book was written in like it was between 1901 and 1904. I'd have to double check. But, he was a Russian aristocrat who had been studying as a naturalist. He hadn't fully seen, like, at that time, Russia was still in the industrializing process. And I mean, I know he'd been around the world and I know he had seen things, but if you're a Russian aristocrat in Russia at the end of the 19th century, talking about industrialism and talking about industrial society and its potentials and downsides, it's all still very speculative. What he had actually seen, his most amazing work, was already done, and he just kept going with it. And I think that's a huge problem within anarchism. That's kind of the point with Green Anarchy is being able to look at all that history again and say, did they go too far? Or was there something that they were finding, the traditional anarchists, classical anarchists, red anarchists, was there something in this tradition that they were finding and holding on to that had meaning, or is this a cargo cult for industrialism?
It's interesting to me that what it sounds like you're saying is that there's this analysis that presents anti-state, anti-government way of looking at things, but then they don't analyze simultaneously all of the ways of life that have come out of statehood and the technology and all those kinds of things that are a product of government and state and control in that way.
So there's a huge issue with him saying, like, what's the state versus what does it look like to make a state level society? And there's been no anarchistic state level society, and I would say naturally that it wouldn't happen.
Right. So it's just interesting to me that they didn't, when they were kind of coming up with the idea of anarchism, that they weren't like simultaneously like, I mean, for me, the idea of like what you're calling primal anarchy now is, and this is getting into another question, is like, why does it have to be primal anarchy? Because to me, anarchy is just, it is already primal anarchy. If you actually look at it from the perspective of being anti-state, you'd think that would make people start at the beginning and think about like, what are the results of statehood, and industrialization is a result of that, right? Or like you're saying, it's like the things that make statehood possible. Like if you're going to critique that and think that you could have this system outside of it, why would you not simultaneously go all the way back?
I mean, I think that the problem with it is, and this happens a lot with social movements, is you're kind of going for the thing that's most immediate to you. So if you're like a part of, I mean, these words meant a lot more in the early 1900s and in the late 1800s, because you're talking about heavy periods of industrialization. You're talking about periods in which there was a very distinct proletarian identity. So those things had more power to them. And it's kind of like, if you're working 12 hours a day and somebody's like, hey, we could be so much more, there's this idea that's like really kicking around that we could own the means of production, and there's like actual movement behind it. Because I mean, that kind of anarchism was a massive movement in the early 1900s. For Russian Jews immigrating to America, the number one political affiliation was anarchist. These were very viable social movements. Not saying that the ideas were viable, but like as an ideal, they did drive a lot of social change. And there's just a kind of like strange traditionalism that we kind of hold up, or a lot of people hold up as like being very romantic and still upholding these ideas, even though they kind of get dated. But I mean, like I said, with Kropotkin, when you're going through mutual aid, he wouldn't disagree with the premise of primal anarchy. He just kind of kept going with it in this like really theoretical way. And just a real quick aside on that, like, I mean, the other side of it too is that the term anarchy and anarchism has gotten a lot more complicated lately. There's always been like weird fringes like anarcho-capitalism and national anarchism, so like straight up capitalist and fascist sides. YouTube and the entire alt-right has just reignited that stuff. I never actually met an anarcho-capitalist until like a couple years ago. And now it's like extreme libertarians and fascists are jumping right on that without hesitation. And I mean, really, it's like, is there anything anarchistic about that? But I mean, I guess, you can say that you don't believe in government and not be pro-egalitarian. We just live in a weird time where the craziest kind of stuff comes up. But that's another reason why I think it's really important to be really careful with the terms, be very specific with the terms. And that's why I would use primal anarchy as a modifier, even though I think it's kind of ridiculous to say it doesn't need a qualifier at all, because the only existence of anarchy that we've ever seen is in primal anarchy. So effectively, the difference between anarchy and anarchism, people who believe or want to live without government and people who do. Nobody living in anarchy has ever had to call themselves an anarchist. No hunter-gatherer has ever been like, what do you think of Bakunin? Doesn't matter. So primal anarchy is basically like the realization that you are a hunter-gatherer, that you were meant to be living within anarchy. You're not meant to be an anarchist. You're meant to be living within anarchy. Again, it's kind of tricky because it is like qualifying something that doesn't necessarily need a qualifier, aside from the fact that the term has been so muddied. And that's one reason why it's become increasingly important for me to point towards this. Really what it comes down to is, we're all stuck in this civilization living lives that have no means of really satisfying or giving us anything positive, and effectively just destroying the potential for life across the planet in every ecological, social, psychological sense. Like, we are in an abusive relationship with domestication. We are having these innate needs torn apart and repackaged and sold back to us as something that is ultimately unsatisfying and fundamentally suicidal. There's just no way to go about any of this kind of discussion or any of this kind of argument that isn't going to be kind of philosophical or theoretical unless you really ground it in reality. And the fact of the matter is that this is our reality. This is how we have evolved. We've evolved as nomadic hunter-gatherers. We've evolved for band society. We are social animals. This is what shapes us on an elemental sense. And in every regard, this is what we come back to. And there's a lot of discussions that kind of come and go about human nature and the questions of human nature, and how states and how societies and governments have used these concepts. But in this regard, it's like, good news is you were prone towards egalitarianism. The most egalitarian societies who have ever existed are the ones that require no instruction at all. They're the ones that function in a completely organic and sustainable manner. And everything about the way that we interact with the world is counterintuitive. And I think a lot of anarchists and revolutionaries and radicals of all stripes have had this tendency to say that capitalism or any particular state of government or anything like that is capable of creating false needs and desires. It's like, this is how domestication works. It's like, this is what you do if you're breaking an animal. This is what you're doing if you're breaking a plant. You just change the context and create this level of dependency, and then that creates a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah. On this Rewilding Facebook group, somebody said, why is rewilding a subset of anarchy on Wikipedia? I don't get it. What does rewilding have to do with anarchy? What's your response to somebody saying, what does anarchy have to do with rewilding?
When you use the term rewild, it's not like rewild, it's to rewild, to become wild again. The premise of the concept of rewilding is you are born wild. This is a matter of reclaiming yourself from the domestication process and, extrapolate that out to the world in every other way. If you have a concept of wildness that isn't going to be this nature channel, survival of the fittest kind of thing, and based more along the lines of say, mutual aid, or based along the lines of like how ecosystems operate, not how systems operate, but how ecosystems intertwine and operate, how interconnectedness is different than dependency. If you're going to understand wild as like, not this scary thing, but this entire functioning system, this entire functioning world, then your relationship to it is very different. And I mean, it's the same kind of thing, because you can take the word wild and mean like somebody's wild and crazy, or you can take the word anarchy and be like, oh, chaos is anarchy. The words are so similar in that regard, and in terms of the ways that they can be taken and the ways that you could see them as a positive or a negative. Those two things absolutely go together. And if you accept the premise that wild primal anarchy of human societies is innately egalitarian, and that the way that the wild functions in general has this level of balance to it, it's pretty impossible to say, I'm going to rewild, but I want to not envelop this idea of anarchy within that. Like, if you remove anarchy from the equation, it's just like a weird sales pitch for, as Danny and the boys and people like that would draw out. It becomes this kind of like weird, almost like CEO retreat deal. Like, I'm going to like take this level of survival as I'm just going to just go at it. Or also, as Danny and the boys would point out, it's the most mundane possible thing on earth. Ask a waiter about what farm their chicken came from. Like, find a spring. It's like, there's cool things about those. Or, I mean, there's not necessarily cool things about those. There's cool things about a spring. It's not necessarily, yeah, you should know where your food comes from, but at the same time, like, it's not rewilding. It does require questioning domestication on an innate level, and that's not always going to be the most radical thing possible. And in a lot of cases, it just isn't. But at the same time, like, you can't neuter it. You can't take it to this point where it's just like, well, there's no innate political or anti-political leaning to any of this stuff. It's like, if you're accepting any of the premises of rewilding, then it becomes more impossible to think this can coexist alongside civilization.
Yeah. So what inspired you to start using the term primal anarchy instead of anarcho-primitivism?
I mean, I've been kind of leading that direction for a long time. I've just felt like the term encompassed a lot more and has a lot less baggage because of the concepts or because of the words. So I will never stop saying that I am an anarcho-primitivist. I'm never trying to distance myself from anarcho-primitivism. And I mean, I've had a heavy hand in shaping anarcho-primitivism. So I have no regrets about that, but we have to take into account that things change and that terminology changes. You know, there was a lot of discussion about it and it went on for quite a while. Do we want to identify with primal anarchy? Do we want to identify with anarcho-primitivism? Or do we just say it's like there's a transition between these two terms and that's that? And I mean, it didn't help the cause of anarcho-primitivism either, that there's a bunch of people apparently on Facebook that have taken it in insane directions. There's a lot there, and there's a lot of people who are like calling themselves vegan anarcho-primitivists, and I know a lot of vegan anarcho-primitivists that have no issues with the premises or anything like that, but anti-hunter-gatherer vegans are a different kind of vegan. And so, I mean, this is a whole different kind of questions. It doesn't make sense to be an anarcho-primitivist and be against hunter-gatherers.
Right.
You can be against the meat industry, and
Yeah.
you can say you don't want to eat meat, but you can't be against hunter-gatherers. The basis of it is a pretty important thing. You know, there are problems with the term primitivism. Primitive is on the word primitivism. I haven't used primitive without quotation marks in like over 15 years, at the very least over 15 years. There's a lot about it that has changed. And you go back to Stanley Diamond's work, you know, in the 60s and 70s and things like that, and going up to the 80s. You know, it was a very kind of political act to say we're going to reclaim the word primitive. Like, if civilization is going to be saying that it's doing this, then primitivism is like, yeah, no, fuck you. We're putting it back in your face. Like, yeah, we're the opposite of that. Like, we're for the opposite. But, you know, I mean, if there's a lot of indigenous voices that are coming up being like, hey, Whitey, you don't get to do that, then who's anybody to say, well, you don't get it? It's like, all right, we don't need the term. Like, we just don't. Yeah, so here's the term, primal anarchy, that removes all of that baggage. And it just became like a totally unnecessary thing, but also it's not an ism. There's not primal anarchism. It's talking about primal anarchy. And then you can see within that, like that, you know, what somebody like Kropotkin or even what classical anarchists were looking at and saying that there's these lineages of resistance that take place all throughout civilization. We can extrapolate different meanings from it, but at the same time, this is that same core. The part of you that's refusing domestication can take any shape. You know, it's not saying I don't have a critique about all those things or anything like that. Or
Sure.
There's not a deeper critique, but it's like the core idea of resistance or the core idea of like standing up to control is a fundamental part of who we are. But when I talked to John Zerzan about it, I'd been having this discussion with him for some time. And for him, it was really important and it was a central aspect of his work for basically forever, but like a really big part of the origins discussion that he'd been doing since the 60s and 70s. Was, you know, asking questions about what civilization was, asking questions about, you know, what symbolic thought meant, asking questions about what symbolic culture meant. And, you know, him and I kind of came to the same conclusion in terms of the ideas evolving. We've got a lot more information now. This stuff has been running decades deep. And I mean, obviously it goes back forever in our timeline. It predates humanity. Primal anarchy isn't a question about what an egalitarian society can look like. It's saying this is what it is. So it's important to have that kind of distinction, have that kind of definitiveness. It doesn't mean there's no questions involved, and it doesn't mean everything is a certainty, but it does mean that like we know what we're fighting for. But I mean, there's another part of it too, and it's a whole other topic. The term anarcho-primitivism. I'm not comfortable with either one of those terms on their own. Like they both need each other to coexist. So if I'm not comfortable just saying anarchist, if I'm not comfortable just saying primitivist, how comfortable am I with the term, and how comfortable am I with the baggage that comes with each? So it's kind of like, well, here's this other term. This is very direct. Like it's very definitive, very clear. This is what we're talking about.
So can you tell me about what the difference is between hunter-gatherers? There's two different terms that often come up: immediate return hunter-gatherer, delayed return hunter-gatherer. I know a lot of people now are actually saying gatherer or hunter. I'm trying to kind of switch my language over to that as well, because obviously gathering is like 80% of the subsistence. Why is hunting the first thing in that? But anyway, in terms of immediate return and delayed return, what's the significance of that difference?
So there's a couple things too. And first off, I'm going to go ahead and nip in the bud on the gather hunter. I was doing that for quite a while. The only anthropologist really that I know that has done it that I respect is Bird David. I think that the idea has typically been that this kind of comes from Woman the Gather, which is in a way a follow-up to, and in other ways kind of a correction to the idea of man the hunter, and that there was a huge feminist influx in anthropology. And I mean, again, none of these studies, none of these things are without fault by any stretch of the imagination. Anthropology has horribly imperialist and colonial like origins and roots, and still does. But there was a large chunk of anthropology that was at the very forefront of really incorporating feminist and ecological ideas in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that shaped a lot of this discourse. And I think the idea with saying gatherer-hunter versus hunter-gatherer was also to kind of maintain that same kind of sexual division of labor and binary, and say it's like, well, women's work versus men's work. But at the same time, that meant identifying more of what women doing solely with gathering and not with hunting. And there's a lot of nuances there. In every hunter-gatherer society, women kill animals and collect animals and insects, reptiles, things like that. Like it was considered, like the digging stick is considered the first multi-tool. It could be used for protection, it could be used for hunting, it could be used for defense. The reason that anthropologists split or tend to split gathering and hunting in terms of ideas has not to do with eating meat or consuming animals. It has to do with the size of the animal and how it's shared. So a lot of the time it's considered that women are going to gather even if they're hunting, because it's not something that's going to be brought back and brought under the general sharing, or the principles of sharing that a society has that would go towards a larger game. And there's plenty of instances where, women are very much involved directly in the hunt in every single regard. But there's like all these kind of different things that we've put on top of it to say it's like the idea of hunter-gatherer is to do with preference for men or versus preference for women. But if you look at it from the terms or the perspective of a hunter-gatherer, hunter-gatherers move camp mostly because of meat and mostly because of fish, mostly because of protein and fat, and almost never just for like what they're gathering. Gathering is just like filling in, and also even if it's 80% of the diet by weight, like when you look at caloric intake, Nora Gagatos has done really awesome work talking about the importance of dietary fat in human evolution, showing that like proportionately 90% of the diet came for optimal human health is fat-based. It doesn't always mean it's animal-based, but I looked at those numbers and I was expecting her understanding of saying 90% was going to be on the high side. So I was looking at the Bushman. Richard B. Lee had done extensive work amongst the Kong, really weighing out all these different aspects, doing nutritional analysis on everything. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be a society that I think is going to break the record. If you're talking about like what happened for humans in the Ice Age, then people who have lived in, desert or savanna lands for tens to hundreds of thousands of years are going to be probably the exception to the rule, especially because they have a lot of tubers. They have a lot of things that would otherwise be higher in carbohydrates, even necessarily just to get water intake as where it's at. So I went through and did the math on it, and came out to like 13% of their diet being predominantly carbohydrate based, or just strictly more like plant-based, there's a lot of the dietary fat that does come from nanga nuts. I don't know how much that would have changed over time with just the basis of having fences in the Kalahari and also the Kalahari drying out because of civilization. But it just goes to show that in every regard, even if it is a smaller percentage of the diet by quantity or by weight or anything like that, nutritionally speaking, animal fats, animal proteins in almost every hunter-gatherer society, and I would presume every hunter-gatherer society prior to colonialism and prior to all the issues of civilization, based their movements and based their actions, based their decisions predominantly off of hunting and fishing and scavenging, which scavenging is another part of the equation that I think it tends to get left off the table considerably. All those things are major factors. So that's why I say hunter-gatherer. It's not because this is men's work and this is women's work, but it's like we can't just transpose our views on gender and sexual division of labor to assume that those values mean anything for them. It's just like hunting is more important in terms of how people perceive meat and what they consider eating, what they consider being fulfilled. So that's a huge aside.
So, well, no, it isn't actually, because what you had me thinking about was most of the stuff that I've read about hunter-gatherer diets is sort of the inversion of that, where I was thinking the reason why I was calling them gatherer hunters is specifically because I thought that the diet was like 80% plant-based with like this minimal amount of meat or fat as like a supplement or something. But what you're saying makes sense in terms of what I've read from Nora as well, and like thinking about ice age migrations and stuff like that, and mammoths, and you're talking about like how much fat is on a mammoth. But it also had me thinking about maybe that's actually, you know, like when we think about delayed return versus immediate return is what I'm questioning now, that what I've been reading as hunter-gatherers, I'm assuming now that maybe that percentage, the 80% plant and this other smaller percent animal, is actually more of like the delayed return type lifestyle that's like already on like the horticultural production side of things. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but that also doesn't work necessarily. And the main thing about it is if you look at percentage by weight versus percentage by caloric percentage or caloric intake, the numbers are very different. So it's like you could have, I mean, it's like you take your plate. If you say that I want to do 10 grams of this and 50 grams of that, and you're talking about lettuce versus a steak, a tiny amount of steak versus leaves and heads of lettuce are not going to be the same. So if you're say 80% of your salad is lettuce, you're getting very little caloric intake from that if you've got steak or chicken or fish on it or something like that. You know, if you put fat on top of it, if you put some kind of like creamy sauce, or you put something marrow on it or something like that, it has to do with being nutrient dense. Or I guess you'd say it has to do with the nutrient density of the foods. It gets confusing because it's two sets of numbers based around the exact same thing yield extremely different results. So yeah, I can understand why it's confusing, and it's also, you know, when you're flattening out hunter-gatherers across the board, there's a lot of changes that happen that are going to impact the way that for the anthropological period or whatever period in which people have been studying and researching food and those kinds of habits, you know, how colonialism and civilization impact all that. When you go down to, you know, like the Philippines and the like Polynesian islands, and there's places where hunter-gatherers are eating predominantly sago, which is very carbohydrate-rich food. But you know, if people are cutting down rainforests, they're removing all the foodstuffs from it, then secondary foodstuffs that aren't as impacted, like sago, are going to increasingly become more important. And sago, I mean, it does require a ton of processing, but a lot of hunter-gatherers in those areas eat them. And if you look in India, where it's been very rampant civilizing processes for a long time, the hunter-gatherers there eat less meat. It's like if you're going to be, I mean, that's the thing about hunter-gatherer adaptivity. It can be a stretch. Like a secondary food source can become a primary food source pretty easily if the animals are being removed. And that's just the unfortunate reality of civilization, is that it is ecocidal, so it is going to cause all these changes. And just because an anthropologist walked in 1975 and didn't realize that there's been 150 years of missionary activity and ranchers wiping out wholesale wild populations, then yeah, if you don't take a historical view on any of that stuff, then it's going to be a lot easier to be like, well, they just don't eat that much meat. It's like, no, probably not really true. To get back to the earlier question, the difference between immediate return and delayed return is fairly straightforward and simple. It's like immediate return hunter-gatherers don't have storage, they don't have surplus, they're nomadic in nature. I know people have said immediate return hunter-gatherer sounds like a really complicated term. It is descriptive. It's like, how do they eat? They hunt and gather. When do they eat it? Immediately. If they don't, than delayed return. And I mean, it's like we can be really like have a lot of nuance about it. And because there's a huge spectrum of delayed return. I mean, delayed return society goes with up to like Arctic hunter-gatherers and subarctic hunter-gatherers who will store food for periods of time to us. Like, the most delayed return society is a capitalistic society where food is a consumable item shipped across the world. Effectively, it's like, how quick do you eat it? And the reason that it's split this way, it's a very materialist analysis, and I'm a cultural materialist at heart. What it means is that the way you subsist with the world impacts the way that you relate to it and relate to each other. And if food is treated as property, if food is treated as something that has value for future point, then it creates wealth. And whenever you have wealth in human societies, then you have the potential for people to have to dictate it and have to control it. It doesn't mean that the first person that has delayed return or the first instance of delayed return meant that a state existed or anything like that. There's a huge spectrum, and there's fully primal anarchy societies or societies living within primal anarchy that had delayed return. There's just a lot less of them. Just like identifying that like this core about power or this core about anarchy within who we are as individuals is that even in societies where there is a chief, or even in societies where there is somebody responsible for divvying up surplus or stored food, that there is still all these checks and balances that could exist that would make it so these societies were still anarchistic. So there's a lot to it, but I mean, I imagine it sounds really daunting at first for a lot of people, but the reality of it is that delayed return is something that arises very late in the human record, and it's not necessarily like a slippery slope to say as soon as it's there everything changes. But I mean, the tendency that we have to look at civilization and to about the ideas of progress is a lot of people think that hunter-gatherers started settling down and then they started gardening and then they started farming and then they built cities. Like 2 cases where that happened, and they're in South America and Central America. Or actually going up to North America, you go up to Mexico. It's like the Uto-Aztecan complex is one of the few places where that particular transition ever happened. Most of the times that civilization started was because of hunter-gatherers settling around massive swaths of wild grains and bumper crop years, and then the population exploding and then going almost straight to agriculture in every one of those cases. The difference between gardening and farming being changing in waterways, a pretty massive thing. So it can be a little tricky, but I think that's the point of like saying is like, well, we need to use these terms. We need to talk about it. Otherwise, if somebody's saying hunter-gatherer, they could talk about a society that had slaves and had extreme power, and societies that had extreme power relatively, versus a society that was just completely anarchistic in nature in every single regard and had significantly less structure and intently so.
So I've got 2 questions for that. One is, what's the point in even really researching immediate return hunter-gatherers in terms of our future? Like, what's the relevance of discussing that and why?
So why do what we do? Why talk about primal anarchy? I mean, so like the benefit of it is like the most central part of it is that we're fed a narrative. We're fed a narrative of progress. We're fed a narrative of civilization. We're fed narratives of domestication. And all those narratives, the whole point is to say, well, that happened before and it's not going to happen again. It's all in the past. You can't go back. You can't turn back time. And I mean, that's a part of the whole primal anarchy aspect. It's part of rewilding. It's part about talking about domestication. It's like domestication was not an event. Civilization was not an event. We create events. We celebrate history and events. But the entire concept of history is about severing ourselves from our relationship to the world and our consequences and our lineages within it. And so there's 2 parts of it. One is that immediate return hunter-gatherers aren't dead. First and foremost, you want to talk about indigenous resistance. You want to talk about these people, people in societies that are on the front lines and dealing with all this. And it's not just immediate return hunter-gatherers. It's delayed return societies, horticultural societies, indigenous societies of all stripes. They're not gone. They are struggling actively. And if you don't understand why that is and you don't understand the importance of it, you really need to be shaken on this. You really need to have it shoved in your face. You really have to be told about it, because that's massively important. The most sustainable societies to have ever existed are being threatened and killed off for the most ludicrous of reasons within civilization. I mean, you're talking about in the Andaman Islands, the Andamanese, you're talking about the Jawa, you're talking about the Sentinelese Islanders are being threatened off because of tourism. Is a major aspect of like what they face, and they face genocide because of that. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty damn important. Like on an understanding level, as a fundamental level, the whole issue is that civilization operates in narratives. As a culture materialist, I believe that the way we interact with the world, the way we subsist, interacts the way that we deal with each other and deal with the world. But nobody talks that way besides economists and sociopaths, which I'm not distinguishing. And we tell stories. That's how we deal with the world. We tell stories all the time. So the stories we tell are massive, and they're massively impacting. If we're told a story all the time that's its whole purpose is to reinforce us to believe that we have no other option other than what civilization has to offer, other than industrialism, then we're going to continue acting that way. And that's why anarchists thought an 8-day labor or an 8-day workday or a 4-day work week was going to be liberation. It's like, no, it still sucks. Just so you know. Didn't turn out so well. Was it better than the thing before? Yeah, maybe. But that's not enough. It's not liberation. It's just saying I want a better leash. So if we're taking in these ideas, if we're taking in this idea that like we're talking about people who have existed before, prior, no longer exist, and that nothing about their lives are of consequence to us because we have the genie's out of the bottle or whatever, then it's going to limit the way that we're able to look at the world. And in a period of rapid, massive climate instability, climate change, climate shifting, and continual resource wars and catastrophic degrees of die-offs and endemic die-offs and massive changes in weather patterns where the basis of civilization, agriculture, is being threatened and the ability of humans to exist on this planet, yeah, we need a better story. We need a bigger story. There's no way out of this that doesn't involve saying, okay, where did we go wrong? And again, that's why I think it's a central question within anarchism, but obviously this goes way beyond it. It's like within anarchism, where does power lie? Where does power originate? That's what distinguishes all these different branches of anarchism. Why does that matter for anybody else? I don't think people need to read anarchist theory. I don't think people need to go through all the backdrop of it. I'm not telling people. That's why I'm not sitting there saying I'm like, I'm an anarchist of this flavor, so go read Bakunin or anything like that. Like, read it if you want, but like, there's more pressing issues. There's more pressing things to be looking at. And if you want to start unraveling this whole thing, any one of these points is going to lead to the same situation. If you're talking about rewilding, if you're talking about primal anarchy, there's no way of saying, oh, well, I guess that, we're just going to go ahead and buy the narrative of that this stuff is all just, this is an intellectual pursuit because all this stuff is dead and gone and come and past. It hasn't. It's not going anywhere. And civilization functions within the same ecological world that hunter-gatherers do. So if there's limitations that hunter-gatherers had to face, if there's limitations that hunter-gatherer society was built around that agrarian societies necessarily are not, then those are weak points. So, does everybody need to read all the theory behind it? No, I think it's helpful. But I mean, that's why the core of my work is to read very dense, dull academic studies about very lively people and then reiterate it, and then to distill that information into something that is hopefully lively and hopefully going to be educational and get people talking about it and getting people to look at it. No, I don't think you need to dedicate your life to studying anthropology, but like, we owe it to these people to understand these societies, to understand what is happening, and also to see how our existence relates to them. Because that's the whole thing. It's like, this is white privilege. This is civilized privilege. We can just go ahead and say, like, I don't want to know about the things that are caused because of my life.
So I've got two questions now. Is like, one, thinking in terms of material determinism, if civilization is essentially like the domino effect of something, and we go all the way back to like immediate return hunter-gatherers, do you think it was a transition from immediate return to delayed return? Or are we just are we going that far back to look at the fact that those immediate returns are more egalitarian than delayed return? In terms of moving forward, like, how far back along the chain of dominoes are we perceiving as possible or desirable? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a big question, and I think that typically what's ended up happening is that because I've focused a lot on immediate return, delayed return, hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, like people saying, well, where am I putting the pin? That's not my goal. Like, my goal isn't to tell people this is what you can or can't do. It's to say you need to be realistic about what the consequences of all these things are. And I think that the reason I'm doing this isn't because I'm trying to critique indigenous societies. I mean, there's things that happen in indigenous societies that I wouldn't want. Personally, I wouldn't want anything to do with. I mean, like, there's no predilection in me that wants to be, a warrior involved in warfare, but it's like the consequences of the world as it is kind of change all that. Is it an ideal for me? No. And is warfare within horticultural societies or delayed return societies anything like it is within this society? No. Was it massively impacted and amplified by it? Absolutely. I give heavy warning to people who are saying, I just want to study anthropology, and they go to a class and they see Napoleon Chagnon's work on the Anunnaki, which is just colonial bravado. Mm-hmm. It's like, here's genocide that was impacted and created by an anthropologist and industry and ranchers and settlers, and then taken out of context and just turned into like, this is the fierce people. It's like, no, we're just dicks. But, the point of the critique and the point of talking about primal anarchy is to show that this is the baseline for who we are. It's not saying that any individual immediate return hunter-gatherer society is or should be the blueprint for how we interact, but to look at things in terms of like, what is the function within a society? Not to, in every way, shape, and form, I'm also saying straight up, don't look at the mythos of a hunter-gatherer society or an immediate return hunter-gatherer society and think that you should replicate that. That's theirs. It's not yours. That's not the problem. If you want to understand the function of a myth, you want to understand the function of a ritual or something like that, that's massively different than being like, well, the key to their society is this myth or is this ritual or this function or whatever plant that they're taking, like the superfood marketer kind of perspective that we have with the world. That's definitively not what I'm talking about. I think that to understand domestication, because domestication process is always going to be channeling the same aspects about what it means to be human. So if you look at minutia about where these things are changing, then you can start to understand the patterns. You can start to understand how these things function. So the core needs of being human, domestication, are always going to target those things. It's going to deal with the realities of being a nomadic hunter-gatherer society, but trying to live in a society that's not based on nomadic hunter-gatherers or not based on the ecological sustainability and pressures that come with being nomadic. So I focus on it not because I'm trying to say what's right and wrong, or what I'm trying to say is like, here's some definitive line, but to have a really realistic understanding about what the consequences are of certain decisions and of certain actions, and then seeing how those things extrapolate. And especially when you're looking at the impacts that colonialism had on horticultural societies and delayed return societies, you can see how these things just like don't scale. Like when you throw industrial technology into it, when you throw capitalist societies or you're throwing markets into these things, they go apeshit, like totally apeshit. That to me is the important part. I'm not sitting here saying like, if you have a garden, then you're the worst person on earth. It's just to say that everything that you think can be done to make food has been done already. And those things have consequences. Have a realistic discussion about it. There's all kinds of people who think this is the same kind of like the cargo cult of industrialism and within communism, within syndicalism. It's like, well, we could do it differently. It's like, no, you can't. I mean, maybe for 5 years, but 100 years from now, that society is going to take the form it's going to take. If we're looking at being, if we're able to control the direction of anything about human society, why not go for the most egalitarian? Why not focus on that? And it doesn't have to be a critique about delayed return societies in terms of like, well, I'm not for them. Of course I'm for them. Like there's plenty of delayed return hunter-gatherer societies that are actively fighting pipelines, and I would be the worst person in the world if I'm like, well, we need to talk about some things first. Not my intent.
Right.
It's not my intent. I'm not trying to like.
Yeah.
I think it's important to focus on those things because you can understand how the patterns work. It's not me putting societies in timeout and saying it's like, well, actually, you guys need to focus on this. It's like going forward or looking at anything. If we can look at anything, this is where it's at. And there's all kinds of people, especially in the permaculture world, most definitely in like the organic world, who are thinking like, well, we'll be able to create some new society that's going to be great and utopian. And well, that's never going to happen. And in fact, it's a breeding ground for some of the worst people within civilization. Mm-hmm. It's like, so, yeah.
Cool. One thing that I appreciate about some of the stuff that I've read from you is in terms of talking about hope, like you're a very hopeful person. it seems like, in terms of the future. I know, like, for me, I go through like waves of despair and hope. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that, like, what is your outlook on the future, and how do you, I don't know if find hope is the right word. It seems kind of like cheesy to put it in that framework, but I don't know what I'm trying to say.
People try to put it into this framework of being hopeful or being optimistic or being pessimistic. Optimism is by no means my default. I'm a pessimistic person. I'm prone to finding problems. I process information in negatives. So it's like, if you tell me if I take in new information, I'm immediately trying to find the problems with it. I'm trying to find the flaws in it and trying to understand it. It's just the way that I deal with things. It's innately, you could say it's innately pessimistic. The opposite of what people would try to paint as me, a picture of me for saying that, like, I'm not against hope. Do I have faith in humanity? I mean, we've survived some insane things. We have developed this resiliency that got us to the quandary of the world is that we've developed resiliency that allowed us to live through ice ages. And it's also the exact same thing that's allowed to live us as diabetics who are eating fast food all the time, that are having to take medication for heart disease. All the problems of civilization were made possible by the resiliency that made it possible for us to get to this point. It just was never the intent. It's not that's not why it happened, but the nature of civilization and the nature of domestication push it to the extent and just keep pushing it, seeing how long you can hold it there. How long can you create a pattern where you can pretend you're controlling nature by dominating it? No, there's no real outcomes where that's a positive thing. But the reality of it is that domestication is a constant thing. It's not this historical event. It didn't just happen once. It happens perpetually. It needs to be constantly reiterated. And the fact that it needs to be constantly reiterated is itself an indication to me of that this primal anarchy within us, this wildness within us, you can't kill it. Like, you can tame it, you can cage it off, but you cannot kill it. And so for me, that's an immense source of hope. That's where that hope comes from. And also the fact is, like, hunter-gatherers didn't die off. They're killed in mass, and they continue to be killed in mass, and they continue to be put through ethnocidal programs and genocidal programs. I mean, these things continue into this day, and this very active force of colonization and trying to wipe people out so people buy the narrative that they didn't exist at all. The idea of giving up hope is also an act of privilege. It's an act of saying, like, well, done. Like, what can we do about it? Well, if you think about it that way, then that's just the case. But the fact of the matter is, if you're still alive within civilization, you're an active agent in civilization. You're an active agent in the collapse one way or another. I don't think that any of this wipes anybody's hands clean. And I think it's really important, too, that people don't try to be, like, Puritan about themselves. I think if people are going to say, well, I'm going to be a hunter-gatherer, I'm just going to remove myself from the equation, part of me is like, cool, I get it. And part of me is like, cool, try it. See what happens. The reason that hunter-gatherers still are struggling in this world is because their way of existence is a threat to civilization itself. That's why they're under attack. That's why they're being killed up. That's why World Wildlife Federation is killing off, or is responsible in working with regimes that are killing off hunter-gatherers, because they're saying they're poachers. It's about the narrative. It's about the story that's being told. And it's about the practicality of even perceiving that options exist, both for these people within their societies and within our own society, or within the civilized world in which we live. So, I mean, there's insane things that we're facing as a society, as a species, as a planet, and they are 100% caused by civilized humans, civilized societies. But, the only way forward is going beyond that. I mean, what would it look like to be a nomadic hunter-gatherer in a post-nuclear world? Or in a world of, like, potential nuclear fallout? I don't know. Is it going to be harder than an ice age? I don't know. Is it going to be harder than anything else that anything else has had? And I mean, I've even asked the question before. It's like, it's not far out. It's something I've heard people talk about, or something I've heard people say. Well, do we even deserve to make it past this? It's like, well, stop making decisions on behalf of humanity. You don't get to do that. We are also a species. Nobody is making a decision that is unilaterally, this is what humans chose to do. It's the consequences of decisions that humans have made, and then patterns and systems that have been reinforced in ways that I'll never understand, that seem to really benefit nobody. We can kind of fall into this misanthropy, and we can fall into all these different kind of forms of apathy, but why? What's the point? You're not going to, like, I mean, I get why people do it, because you want to be able to forgive yourself of what's happening. And it's scary. It's a fucking scary world. And the shit that we've got coming is worse. The Amazon's burning, the polar caps are melting. It's not good. But I see this thing all the time where people are like, the human population could be extinct by 2050, or it could be extinct by 2100. People are more comfortable with the idea that we're all going to die than with the idea that, like, maybe we could do something about it. Maybe civilization itself is the problem. Doesn't mean you're all going to die if civilization is gone. It means civilization dies. And civilization's got to die regardless. Every civilization collapses. It's just the nature of it. What goes up must come down. Principles of physics. If you push carrying capacity, it won't go on that way forever. Control is an illusion.
I have a lot more questions, but I feel like we've already been talking for a long time, so maybe we'll do another interview in the future here. I just wanted to ask if there was any last things you wanted to say in terms of any of this stuff, in terms of rewilding and primal anarchy, that you're like, I need to get this point across, or, you know, just anything in particular.
I'm sure I could think of a lot of things. I mean, I guess the biggest thing I'd say is that, like, you know, keep digging on all these things. Like, don't let complexity scare you. There's periods of time where you just kind of like get this feeling where you look down and things look daunting. And if somebody's trying to sell you a shortcut, you should be very wary of them. And there's a lot of people in the rewilding world that are trying to sell shortcuts right now. When you're talking about rewilding, you're talking about rebuilding relationships. You're talking about changing the way that you interact with the world by removing pieces of this civilized domesticating vision. And I think that that's one of the reasons why permaculture became such a thing. Like, a lot of people who would have otherwise been rewilding or had been in rewilding, you know, it's a lot easier to be like, well, we could just find an ecological way to control things. It's like, you can't reinvent the wheel. It's been made. An horticultural society has its own things and has its own I'm not going to say issues, but just has its own particulars. You're not going to avoid that. And it's just like this super short-sighted vision we have of like, well, how am I going to make it the next year, the next 5 years? This very survivalistic vision we have, it doesn't hold up anything to the reality of what it means to be a being alive on this planet, which is that all the decisions we make, all the things we do are going to be determined over generations, not years. And what you do now isn't necessarily, I mean, it can change things, but at the same time, you know, if you're doing the same thing as your dad or your parents or whatever, it's probably going to keep going on that path. It's probably going to keep going that way. So don't have this hubris of thinking like, if I think differently about doing the same thing, that it's going to be different for me. 0% of the world has ever worked that way. Yeah, I mean, when you get these moments of like looking down and feeling like it's just like super daunting, it is. I mean, if you take the whole thing, it is. And I think this is why Rewilding does focus on steps. And it's why, you know, I've got this piece that was in Black Green Review number 5 called Feral Revisions, and it's just me kind of like joking about, I mean, in some degrees joking, but also talking about my time or like my different experiences and my different takes on the rewilding path. And it's like, you know, how it looked in the start was comedic. It was like survivalist stuff. It's like, I'm going to get these military manuals and I'm going to go out and I'm going to learn all these things. It's like, it doesn't work that way. And there's really just this aspect of, you know, what I've considered like radical humility, where you're just like going out with all these grand schemes and realizing the complexity and simplicity of the natural world coexist. And there's all these aspects about the way that species interact and the way that species relate and the way that it's like that ecosystems relate to each other, that sometimes the realization is the simplest path. It's like, you know, what would a crow be saying to a cardinal or a blue jay? It's like, if you're looking at it from this very heady perspective, it's like, well, can they communicate? Are these things different? And it's like, you know, well, if you watch them long enough, it's like, if you eventually come to the presumption, it's like, why wouldn't they? Like, these species coexisted for a long time, and there's messages to be had between all of them. And understanding it's not the survivalistic thing, it's mutual aid. It's like, these are whole ecosystems. I think that that's important, and it's going to just take a matter of time of becoming familiar and acquainted with wildness as a concept and wildness as a reality. And again, and I know people say it all the time, like, well, I live in a city, I don't have access to all these wild spaces. Like, wildness is everywhere. Civilization is 99% maintenance. Like, like I think it was in 2016 was the last time I saw the number, I thought. But I think in 2016, New York City had 500 spats of widespread glyphosate spraying. Like, the amount of effort it takes to keep civilized all these controlling structures intact is a ton of work. And there's this James Bridle wrote this book, New Dark Age, and he's talking about the infrastructure of the internet and how it follows old colonial paths. It's a really good book. But the nature of computational thinking, like the infrastructure that makes all this world exist is not set up to scale. It's not capable of sustaining itself in any way, shape, or form, but it's not capable of dealing with the realities of climate change that its use has caused. So, I mean, it's as simple as understanding, like starting with trying to understand how different things relate, how to look outside the narrative of civilization, look outside the narrative of domestication, and seeing how these things relate and seeing how these things interact. And then also applying that to civilization itself. If civilization says, well, we've got rounded ready corn and that's just it. This is what it is. This is what you're stuck with. If Elon Musk is like, I'm just going to bore tunnels all across the United States or something like that, just because they say it doesn't mean it's going to work. It doesn't mean it's going to exist, or it doesn't mean it's going to happen. Or if he says he's going to colonize Mars or occupy Mars, well, you used a picture. You've put a red filter over a picture of the moon. You couldn't even figure that out. You're not going to do it. It's not going to work. And they're going to try. People are going to keep trying crazy things. It doesn't mean that they're going to work.
Yeah.
So the importance of it is just like undermining at every step of the way those narratives and undermining those stories, and also realizing our place within the world.
I just had another question pop into my mind that's more along the lines. You've already answered kind of some of this anyway earlier, but and maybe this is just a plug to support some of your work and sell some of your stuff in that regard. But you have the t-shirt. You have the t-shirt that says "You were born wild." 2 questions. What do you mean by that? And of all of the like phrases you could put on the front of a t-shirt, why that one?
Actually, I didn't design that one, so I can't even. I'm not going to take credit for it. But a really good friend of mine did, and I'm really grateful for her input. And that one was done really well, and people were really excited about it. But no, I think that's a core aspect of both Rewilding and Primal Anarchy. That's a core aspect of these narratives. It's a core aspect of the work. Like, this isn't starting from a very heady place. This isn't starting from, 8th tier philosophical theory or political theory or something like that. The reality of our existence, the reality of our world is everything that we see in place because of civilization is meant to be a reminder of, or a way of telling us that we are meant to be civilized, that we're on this trajectory, and that this is who we are. And once the genie's out of the bottle, that's that. And that's the core of it has to keep coming back to the reality that, like, the reason we're having these constant interactions, the reason we're having these narratives bombarded upon us all the time, is because that narrative is wrong. Like, we were born wild. We were born as hunter-gatherers. We were born for an egalitarian society. And that means that we were born wild. We are a social animal. We act like other social animals. The sooner we understand that, and the sooner we use that as a base point, the better we can understand ourselves. And it's not about some ideological construct. It's not about well, you gotta put this revolutionary thing on, and after the revolution we'll understand that we're wild. It's like, no, how you function, how your body moves, how your brain reacts to things is based on the wild existence. And marketers understand that, domesticators understand that, and that's what they're constantly working against. So the sooner we understand that, the easier it'll be for us to start seeing outside of these narratives and realize there's more within our grasp than we want to believe or that we've been told.
Awesome. What is the difference between wildness, or what is wildness, and what is domestication?
So I know that there's a lot of discussion about those terms in particular. The reality of wildness is that it is like undefinable, and the degree to which it is undefinable is both intentional and useful. Like, there's a concept that the Mabudi have. It's called Pepe Nade Nadura. It's like the breath of the forest. Like there's a spirit of the world. It's not a conscientious force. It's just that there is a breath of air that moves through all things. And I know he's not a good person, but like even Neil deGrasse Tyson, it's like there's an innately spiritual element of understanding that the elements of what make up each one of us are spread throughout each one of us. And like even there's been a lot of scientific talk about microbiomes and like all these degrees to which like what constitutes you is in no shape or form ending at your physical body. There's all these different kind of constructs for realizing the interconnectedness of the world that isn't some new age woo-woo kind of thing, but like a very practical matter. It's like we are tied together, and energy is constant. You can look at it from a very scientific perspective. You can look at it from a very spiritual perspective. You can take it in all these different directions, but at the core of it, there is this part of life, or this existence and interconnectedness within life that doesn't necessarily translate to something that's quantifiable by science, or something that's not quantifiable within our language. And a lot of people, I mean, that's where a lot of ideas about religion and a lot of perspectives that people get become this very twisted view of this phenomena, if you want to call it that. But really, to me, it's like wildness is just like this untamable spirit at the core of who we are. The more it becomes defined, the more you get marketers coming in and trying to sell it, which is why I think it's very important to not define it. And that's why I think it's very important to distinguish like this kind of like, I say spiritual anti-theism for myself, but this perspective and this interaction with the world that is saying that these things do happen. This is there, but it's definitively not religion. It's definitively not God, even if people try to kind of take these forms of it. But the more something becomes defined, the more it can become religious, the more it can become doctrine, the more it can be taken out of context and removed from place in every way, shape, or form. So when I'm saying wildness, it's really just that untamable spirit. Boiled down to anything, that's that. I mean, you can't put that in a dictionary, and that's true. And that's true to what it should be, I think. Domestication, there's different forms for domestication. There's social and physical, or social and biological domestication. Biological domestication, I think that there's degrees to which these terms even are kind of a little bit dated in how we approach them. But ideally, biological domestication is applied to plants and animals. I think it's probably truer for plants than animals, but again, there's a lot more that I think we're going to keep learning about the way that plants interact that will potentially change it. But the idea of biological domestication is that you physically change something so that it becomes dependent upon a circumstance. You see that in extreme forms with something like Cornish cross chickens, like the standard chicken people get at the store. It's not even a breed. It's it's considered an industrial product by all legal definitions. But a Cornish cross chicken, like I've seen people try to keep them alive. I've seen vegans try to keep them alive. I've seen people have them on pasture for too long. And what ends up happening is their breast grows so fast that it crushes their chest and they die. Pretty horrible deaths. And I've seen it many times. Yeah, that's domestication, like cut and dry. You're talking about a very extreme form. But like theoretically, a domesticated plant or animal would be innately different from its wild perspective to the point where it becomes dependent upon civilization. But the existence of like so many feral animals for all different kinds of species, I think throws a lot of that into it. Like people see biological domestication as a one-way street. I think social domestication is more a reality. But I think biological domestication, one part of it is it's imposed. I think that's really the one defined feature that imposed by another species, in our case, human species, or humans upon other animals. I think that's the one part of that definition that'll stick. But social domestication is really about taming other humans, like to become domestic, to make for the home. There's a really good book out there called Domestication of Human Species by Peter Wilson. And it talks about changes in even the way that structures change with societies as domestication is introduced, and just the act of splitting apart roles and creating hierarchies and things like that, and how they relate to how people physically live in any given space. So there's like stuff about that I think is like really fascinating that I know is going to sound boring to people when you hear it. I assure you, not all of it is as boring as any pitch is going to make it sound. But effectively, it just comes down to the narratives. Like if we're talking about social domestication, we're talking about people who have power or control in a society dictating how other people view and interact the world. And that could take a lot of different forms, and it could take a lot of different degrees of severity. And even though, like I said, in minutia, you can see it when you're looking at the difference between an immediate return hunter-gatherer society and a horticultural society, you see it a little bit there, but then you compare like how that functions and how that works, and then compare it with like how we interact with the world within this civilization versus, hunter-gatherer horticulturalists. Really see it. Like you genuinely see it. So I know that people try to blur the lines a lot. And again, I think there's a degree to which, are plants and animals necessarily biologically domesticated? Is it a one-way street? I mean, those are different kinds of questions, but then there's also people who want to say that any degree of use is domestication, which is a pretty perverse way of understanding it. And yeah, I mean, I think that the conversations about tending the wild, permaculture and horticulture and things like that, the delayed return, immediate return thing answers a lot of those questions too.
Cool. That's all I got for the moment.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, it would be awesome to follow up and do another interview specifically about like the re-release of your book and the cult of personality and all of that kind of stuff too, because I have, after reading it, obviously I've thought a lot about it. Put a quote on the back of it, but it'd be awesome to actually chat more about that stuff, especially of gods and just talking about missionaries and all that kind of stuff. But that seems to be like a whole other chunk of time that we should spend. I
could not stop talking about that stuff. So
yeah, I could tell. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on here. I'm really glad to have this interaction with you in a way that, I don't know, over the years, we've had different types of interactions. And I'm just really happy to connect with you face to face in this regard. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Rewilding conference in January.
Yes, I will definitely be there this time.
Awesome.
But yeah, no, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, things take turns. But yeah, this is a good one.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the listeners out there for tuning in. Check out the podcast notes to connect with Kevin and follow up on some of the resources mentioned during our conversation. Keep in mind that if you've got a question you'd like to ask me, you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, and send me your questions there, or you can join the conversations at the rewild.com forum. Please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and if you'd like to contribute to the future of this podcast, you can become a monthly supporter through the link in the podcast notes. Thanks so much.